In Chapter 17, we're going to cover the urinary system. The urinary system consists of 2 kidneys, 2 ureters, 1 urinary bladder, and 1 urethra. The function of the urinary system includes releasing nitrogenous waste to the outside. These are organic molecules that contain nitrogen. The urinary system helps maintain normal concentration of electrolytes in water. It regulates the pH and fluid volume within the body. It helps control red blood cell production and regulate blood pressure. Let's look at the kidneys. The kidneys are reddish-brown in color, and they are kidney bean shaped. And I don't know what came first, the kidney or the kidney bean, but they're kidney bean shaped. They're about 12 centimeters long, and they're enclosed in a tough, protective, fibrous capsule. Kidneys are located in a retroperitoneal position. Remember from Chapter 1 when we discussed serous membranes that the peritoneum is a double-layer membrane that encloses many but not all of the abdominal organs. The kidneys are located posteriorly to the peritoneal membrane. The kidneys are located on each side of the vertebral column, and their location is between the 12th thoracic and 3rd lumbar vertebrae. Due to the asymmetry of the liver, the left kidney sits slightly higher than that of the right. There is connective tissue and adipose tissue that help to anchor the kidneys in place. In this image, you can see the location of the kidneys. You can see the renal fascia, which is a supported membrane that helps to keep the kidneys in place. There's fat, the adipose capsule, which helps to cushion the kidneys. And then we mentioned that there is a fibrous capsule found on the surface of the kidneys, also referred to as the renal capsule, which is also protective in nature. The hilum is the indentation found in the medial aspect of the kidney. Slightly within that area, you'd reach the renal sinus. The renal sinus is where blood vessels, nerves, lymphatic vessels, and the ureter are found. So there would be blood vessels entering as well as leaving the kidney. The ureter exits from this area. The renal pelvis is subdivided into major and minor calyces. There's 2 distinct regions of the kidneys. There's the rena medulla, which I always remember like the middle part. It's not over where like the pelvis or sinus is, but it's deep to the cortex. This houses the renal pyramids, and they look like a triangle or pyramid in structure. There's about 8 to 18 renal pyramids per kidney. Where these triangles come to a point is known as the renal papilla. The term papilla simply means point. On the outside of the kidney is the renal cortex. So this surrounds the medulla, but there are areas of the cortex that dip down into the area between the pyramids. This is known as the renal columns. Located in the renal cortex are the nephrons. The nephrons are the microscopic filtration unit of the kidney. This image shows the kidney, and you can see the cortex, the medulla. Within the medulla, you see the pyramids that come to a point. This is known as the rena papilla. From here exits urine, and urine can either flow into a minor calyx, but in 2 to 3 locations per kidney, there are areas where the minor calyxes quickly merge together, and these are known as a major calyx. I don't know, my best description of this is that if you, like the pyramid is a house, right? And then the minor calyx is like the driveway that goes down to the street. And sometimes you see houses where you go up one driveway and it splits to each individual house. So where you have these situations where driveways are kind of shared, that would kind of represent a major calyx. The blow-up picture on the right shows you the structure of a nephron, which we'll go into more detail. But you can see a majority of the nephron is located in the cortex, though the renal tubule will dip down into the medulla. Functions of the kidneys is that it acts to regulate volume, composition, pH of body fluids. It also functions to remove metabolic wastes. We mentioned nitrogenous wastes in an earlier slide. This would be an example of a metabolic waste. The kidneys control the rate of red blood cell production by secreting the hormone erythropoietin, which is abbreviated EPO. The kidneys detect when blood oxygen levels are decreasing, secrete EPO, and this stimulates red blood cell production. The kidneys also regulate blood pressure by regulating fluid volume. The higher the volume of blood, the higher would be an individual's blood pressure. The kidneys also play a role in the activation of vitamin D by the manufacture of the hormone calcitrol, which allows for its absorption from the small intestine. The renal blood vessels include the renal artery and renal vein. The renal arteries are branched off the abdominal aorta. The renal veins feed into the inferior vena cava. This slide demonstrates the renal artery and vein. We're not going to concern ourselves with the smaller branches that arise from the renal artery or that merge together, generating the renal vein. The nephrons are the microscopic unit of the kidneys. Each kidney contains about 1 million nephrons. The nephron consists of 2 main components, the renal corpuscle and the renal tubule. This slide shows the 2 main components of the nephron. The renal corpuscle is the filtration unit of the kidney. It consists of a ball of capillaries called the glomerulus, and then the glomerular capsule that receives the filtrate. Let's look at a picture. Blood enters into the glomerulus through the glomerular capillaries, and it then also exits. The glomerulus is very leaky, and so small molecules exit the glomerular capillaries and then are picked up by the glomerular space. This acts as a filtration unit. Filtration is a physiological process where molecules are separated based on size. Red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, blood proteins are too large to exit the glomerular capillaries. But small molecules such as water, sugars, amino acids, and wastes are small enough, and so these molecules are captured in the glomerular capsule. The renal tubule consists of 3 components. The proximal convoluted tubule, and convoluted just refers to the kind of twisted shape of this portion of the renal tubule. This functions in reabsorption, the nephron loop, which functions in reabsorption, and the distal convoluted tubule, which functions in some secretion and some reabsorption. I must also add there is some secretion that occurs in the proximal convoluted tubule, and we're going to go over these processes in a few moments. Several distal convoluted tubules are going to join together to become a collecting duct. A collecting duct is a tube that passes into the medulla of the renal pyramid and empties into the minor calyx. At the papilla, remember the papilla is just a little point at the bottom of the pyramid. At this time, the filtrate can be referred to as urine. This diagram shows a collecting duct, and you can see that there's several nephrons that are attached. The collecting duct extends all the way down to the bottom of the renal pyramid and enters into the minor calyx. There are two types of nephrons. About 85% of all nephrons are called cortical because a majority of the entire nephron is found in the cortex. If you look at the image, you just see a very small portion of the nephron loop extending into the medulla. These are your kind of like everyday, regularly acting nephrons. Juxtamedullary nephrons are nephrons that have very long nephron loops. So you can see that the glomerulus, which on this diagram it refers to it by kind of the old school name, the Bowman's capsule, is located right on the border between the cortex and the medulla, right? And almost the entirety of the nephron loop, okay, used to be called the loop of Henle, this happens in anatomy all the time, is located in the medulla. And what happens, as you extend further down through the medulla, there's an increase in concentration of salt. There's a salt gradient. And what the salt does allows the conservation of water. Okay, the number one rule of the urinary system, remember, is water always follows the salt. You can get small molecules to move from one area to the other through mechanisms such as diffusion, facilitated diffusion. There's only one way to get water to move, and that's through osmosis. And osmosis is where water flows from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So by increasing the salt gradient, you're decreasing the amount of water, and this makes it more preferable for water reabsorption. Okay. When substances are reabsorbed, that means they are going from the nephron, they're going back into the circulatory system. So these are water-conserving nephrons. If you look at animals such as kangaroo rats that live in the desert, they have all of their nephrons are juxtamedullary because they have very little available water for them to drink, and so they need to be able to conserve as much water as possible. This diagram is a little bit more complex, and it shows you the peritubular capillaries. These are capillaries that are surrounding the nephron loop. And so this is the area of water reabsorption, where water is going to exit the nephron loop and go back into the bloodstream. Okay. Urine formation involves 3 stages: glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion. Glomerular filtration occurs in the glomerulus, and this is where the fluid portion of blood is filtered by the glomerulus. As I mentioned previously, the glomerular capillaries have very small slits, which is going to allow small molecules to exit. This fluid, along with small molecules, are going to enter the glomerular capsule. And at this point, it's just referred to as filtrate. It's not referred to as urine yet. The filtrate is mostly water. It also contains substances that you may want to reabsorb, such as electrolytes, glucose, I know it's not listed here, but amino acids, and some waste products such as urea and uric acid. These are examples of nitrogenous wastes that were mentioned in the beginning of this presentation. This diagram shows filtration in a little bit more detail. Blood's going to flow in through the afferent arteriole. The term afferent always means towards, where efferent means away. So this is kind of a unique setup because the blood's going from an arteriole to a capillary to an arteriole to another capillary. Okay? So filtration occurs in the glomerular capillaries where small molecules are able to exit. That becomes the filtered fluid or filtrate. And you can see in this diagram, the process of reabsorption is where molecules exit the renal tubule and go back into your circulatory system, while secretion is where molecules flow in the opposite direction. Since water is a very small molecule, about 180 liters of filtrate are generated per day. Boy, that will be a lot of urine, okay? So most of this needs to be returned to your bloodstream, and this is the process of tubular reabsorption. This diagram is demonstrating average urine volume is between 0.6 and 2.5 liters a day. Now, this is going to depend on how much water you had to drink, whether you consume foods that were like kind of rich in water, like things like fruit that have a lot of natural water in them, what the environmental conditions are like, have you been hot and sweating, right? Your level of physical exertion, right? But the average normal range is between 0.6 and 2.5 liters a day. So from that 180 liters, all is reabsorbed to about the 0.6 to 2.5 liters. All right, tubular secretion. Right. Remember from our diagram, that's where substances are moved from the blood to the tubule for elimination. Don't worry about the names of the ions, but hydrogen, ammonium, potassium ions can be secreted. Creatinine, which is a breakdown product of creatine phosphate, which is found in your muscles, is secreted. Some urea is also secreted. Hormones, a variety of drugs are very rapidly secreted. Penicillin, beta blockers, morphine is another one. So drugs that have a rapid secretion rate are typically drugs you have to dose several times a day. Right? So if you're on penicillin, you may have to take that several times a day. There are some newer medications that have like a slow release to them, but if something's rapidly secreted from the kidneys, it means it's not going to be in the bloodstream to be able to target, okay, whatever type of infection, it needs to help cure. Not going to worry about all the numbers that are on here, but what is interesting, if you look at sodium, that plasma is your blood levels. And this is milliequivalents per liter, right? So plasma levels about the same as glomerular filtrate level. Your urine level's a little lower. So that means you reabsorb some sodium within this process. Potassium, you can see the urine levels are 60. That means potassium was therefore secreted. A little bit of calcium secreted, a little bit of magnesium secreted. Same thing with chloride. There's some bicarbonate ions that are reabsorbed. Sulfate, phosphate. So it's just, you can kind of look at this and see which types of substances were either reabsorbed or secreted. Now, at the bottom, you can see that your blood plasma level of glucose is typically about 100 milligrams per 100 mils. Glucose is a small molecule, so you're going to have about the same concentration and the glomerular filtrate, but that all glucose should be reabsorbed so that you don't have any glucose present in your urine. Reasons why you may have glucose in your urine is maybe you just had, you just had like a bunch of candy at a really high carbohydrate meal, or you're suffering from diabetes mellitus, which means your plasma levels are so high that your kidneys, or nephrons specifically, are not able to reabsorb enough of this glucose as the filtrate is passing through the proximal tubule. So the proximal convoluted tubule is the only area where like amino acid and glucose reabsorption occurs. So if the filtrate is flowing through and the concentration is really high, not all of it can be reabsorbed. You can see a lot of urea is secreted as well as uric acid. Don't worry about any of the values. It's just to kind of demonstrate that by you comparing what's in the plasma, what's in the filtrate, what's in the urine, you can kind of tell what type of molecules are moving in which direction. This is probably something you're well aware of. If you haven't had anything to drink for a while, you're not going to have to urinate as frequently, and the urine that is produced is more concentrated. If you have a lot of water to drink, or a lot of liquids, you're going to urinate more frequently, and the urine produced is going to be less concentrated. So the kidneys act to regulate urine concentration and volume. And the way this is done is the distal convoluted tubule and collecting ducts typically are impermeable to water. So in this area, water is not being reabsorbed. So whatever water is remaining in the filtrate after it exits the renal loop is going to be into your urine, right? So your urine is going to be fairly dilute, right? If you haven't had anything to drink in a while, there are osmoreceptors that are found in the hypothalamus, and they're going to detect, basically they're detecting your blood volumes going down, which means you need to start conserving water. And so antidiuretic hormone is released, in response to decreases in blood, water volumes or fluid volumes. These segments become permeable and more water is reabsorbed. And since water is being reabsorbed here, the urine that is produced is going to be fairly concentrated. Yes, this is true. Coffee and alcohol will make you pee more. You can watch the video link, which is below this presentation, but both caffeine and alcohol inhibit the release of ADH, so you produce more dilute urine. The only disadvantage here is this is being kind of abnormally triggered, and this can leave you feeling somewhat dehydrated. Especially if you've had a lot of alcohol to drink. So a good way to remember ADH is a damn hangover. When you drink alcohol, it inhibits ADH release. You release a larger volume of urine. It leaves you dehydrated, which contributes to a hangover. As we mentioned, the release of ADH is triggered by water volume within the blood, right? So the concentration of water in your blood decreases. Now you're still going to have the same amount of red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, blood proteins, nutrients. So what's varying here is the amount of water. So your blood's really becoming more concentrated, and that's what's being decreased by the osmoreceptors. Osmotic pressure is the pressure exerted by solutes within a solution, right? So decreases in blood volume are going to trigger these osmoreceptors, and then the osmoreceptors signals the posterior pituitary gland to release ADH. It travels to the kidneys. If this then increases water reabsorption by allowing water to be reabsorbed from the distal convoluted tubules and the collecting duct, and then your urine becomes more concentrated, but this acts to elevate your overall blood volume. The force responsible for moving substances by filtration through the glomerular capillary wall is the filtration pressure. And the filtration pressure is generated by your blood pressure. Now, hydrostatic pressure just means the pressure exerted by a fluid on the walls of its container. The hydrostatic pressure in this case is created by your blood pressure. The goal here is your blood pressure has to be high enough for your nephrons to be able to filter your blood. So a net filtration pressure must remain positive. Okay, we're going to go over this diagram kind of briefly, okay? So it's showing the glomerular hydrostatic pressure. Remember, the hydrostatic pressure is generated by your blood pressure, and this is going to cause small molecules such as water and nutrients and wastes to exit into the capillary space. That is what we want. But as fluid enters the capsular space, it kind of generates a back pressure, and this is a force that opposes filtration. This is a little bit more involved, but the presence of red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, blood proteins that remain in the blood is generating osmotic pressure. Remember, osmotic pressure is a movement of water from high concentration to low concentration. So this is also an opposing force. What do you need to take out of this? You need to have the forces that are geared toward filtration greater than the forces that are against filtration. If your blood pressure drops too low, the forces against filtration, or they're showing this as a negative, is going to be greater, and your kidneys are going to fail. You're not going to be able to remove wastes. It's like if you had a garden hose and have a bunch of holes in it, and you just turned it on a little trickle, you're not going to have enough water exiting this hose, to be able to filtrate your blood. Another hormone that affects the volume of urine, but it's similar to ADH, but aldosterone has a different trigger point, okay? So aldosterone is secreted by the adrenal gland, and this is due to drops in blood pressure. So remember, the kidneys, they need to have a positive filtration rate. There are specialized cells in the kidneys that are going to detect that blood pressure is starting to drop, and then they're going to trigger the release of aldosterone. An example of when this would occur, perhaps if you were hemorrhaging or you were extremely dehydrated and had a very low blood volume, right? So this also stimulates DCT, distal convoluted tubule, right, to reabsorb water. The mechanism is just a little different. Where in ADH, there's little water pores that open that allow reabsorption. What aldosterone does is it increases the reabsorption of sodium ions. You remember, number one rule in the urinary system, water follows the salt, and that's going to drive the reabsorption of water. This will then increase your blood volume and blood pressure. So both ADH and aldosterone are having the same effect as having the body reabsorb more water, produce lesser volume and more concentrated urine. It's just they're kind of be triggered differently. So ADH is being triggered by the water volume in your blood, which we know is directly related to blood pressure. Aldosterone is being triggered by a drop in blood pressure. Oh, yes, you can. Make sure you watch this video link. We mentioned the kidneys release EPO or erythropoietin. This is released in response to low blood oxygen levels. Red blood cells only live about 4 months, so they're constantly being manufactured and old worn out red blood cells being destroyed. And so in order to regulate and make sure you have enough red blood cells to deliver sufficient oxygen, when blood oxygen levels drop, EPO stimulates the production of new red blood cells. Even with all this water reabsorption, urine still contains about 95% water. It contains urea, uric acid. These are breakdown products of the metabolism of proteins and nucleic acids, as well as creatinine, which is a breakdown product of creatine phosphate, which is found in your muscles. It may contain trace amounts of amino acids, and since the kidneys are balancing your electrolyte levels, they contain varying amounts of electrolytes. The volume varies with your fluid intake, how much water you're drinking, what type of foods you're eating. Is it really warm out? Have you been exercising? So sweating is also going to, impact the amount of urine that's produced. Glucose, proteins, ketones, and blood cells are normally not found in urine, so their presence may indicate disease. Now, why am I saying may indicate disease? If you decided I'm like sitting down eating all my Halloween candy in one night, yeah, you might have some glucose in your blood the next day. You're unable to reabsorb all the glucose in your bloodstream. Having a huge steak for dinner or another high protein meal may cause the presence of some proteins in your urine. Ketone bodies, these are breakdown products of fat metabolism. If, for instance, you're on the ketone diet, you may have ketone bodies or ketones in your urine. So that's why it says may indicate disease. And for these substances, what's considered negative is usually under a particular threshold. You should not have red blood cells or white cells, right? They typically do indicate infection, right? And as I mentioned before, having, consistent glucose levels could be indicative of having diabetes mellitus. So looking at normal urine, the pH, this is going to vary, right, depending on what type of electrolytes have been secreted, for 5 to 8 with an average of pH of 6. So 7 is neutral, so slightly acidic. Specific gravity is a measurement of density. And so the specific gravity of water at 25 degrees C is 1.000, right? So if you're having creatinine, urea, uric acid present, it should be denser, right? Contain more solutes than water. But if it's above 1.030, it's kind of indicating there's too many solutes in there. Maybe this is due to the presence of like glucose or proteins, which again could indicate disease. We mentioned average urine volume, about 0.6 to 2.5 liters. Color. The color of urine is due to the presence of urochrome, and this is a breakdown product of red blood cell metabolism. So this is a yellow pigmented compound. The odor of the urine may vary depending on what type of foods you've consumed. Urine should not contain any bacteria and should be sterile. So going back before urinalysis was readily available, doctors actually would, look up, swirl a urine specimen, see if it looked cloudy. Cloudiness would indicate a higher than normal specific gravity, right? There's something in there that's preventing it from having a clear yellow color. They would smell, this is true, and taste a patient's urine specimen. If you listen, if you have diabetes, your urine's gonna don't do this, but should taste slightly sweet. So we've produced the urine, and now it's going to exit the kidneys and enter into the base or bottom part of the bladder through the two ureters. Urine is produced continuously, and peristaltic waves and gravity convey the urine to the urinary bladder. And there's kind of like a flap-like valve that allows it to enter. So peristaltic waves is the contraction, rhythmic contraction of smooth muscle. So you can have urine go from your kidneys into your bladder like while you're sleeping or laying down. So gravity assists, obviously, but it's not essential or necessary. The urinary bladder itself is a hollow, distendable muscular organ which is found in the pelvic cavity. The bottom of the bladder, it kind of looks like a triangle, is called the trigone, and that consists of the opening kind of on the top part of the triangle where the two ureters enter, and then the bottom part, it comes to a point where the exit of the urethra is found. This shows a male urinary bladder. You can tell by the appearance of the prostate gland. Kind of gives you an idea that trigone looks like a triangle, right? So the bladder, like a balloon, is going to distend upward as it fills. And so it makes sense that the ureters are going to enter into the bottom, more stationary portion. The urinary bladder is able to store between 200 and 800 milliliters of urine. Urine release is controlled by two sphincters, right? So from the bladder, the urine is going into the urethra. There is an internal urethral sphincter, and this one is involuntary, consists of smooth muscle. But luckily, you have a voluntary external urethral sphincter. Micturition is the, I guess, medical term for urination. And so the urine leaves the bladder by the micturition reflex. The urinary bladder contains a detrusor muscle which contracts, and then the external urethral sphincter needs to be relaxed. Stretching of the urinary bladder as it fills with urine triggers the micturition reflex center. So everyone knows you're sitting there and you start standing, whatever, start to feel like you have to urinate, right? Your frontal cortex can override the micturition reflex until, like, you have time to go to the bathroom, or in the video they say, I think urination is more appropriate, okay? But you can only override the reflex so long, right? At some point, you really would need to urinate. And I'll just mention this kind of weird fact here. So why do people urinate if they become very scared or excited? In situations like that, your limbic system takes control of your emotions. And if your bladder is full, your frontal cortex might not be able to override the reflex. Urethra is the tube that conveys urine from the urinary bladder to the outside, where it exits through the external urethral orifice. Orifice just means like opening. The female urethra is about 4 centimeters long, and it's located between the vagina and clitoris. The male urethra is about 20 centimeters long, and it serves both the urinary and reproductive system. It runs through the prostate gland and the penis. This is not a well-known fact. If you receive a kidney transplant, Your kidneys are left in place unless they are cancerous. So you can see here is a transplanted kidney and it's attached to the external iliac artery and vein. And the reason for this is, what if the transplanted kidney was rejected? You don't want to receive one of the other kidneys if it's healthy, even if it's not, functioning to optimum level. Diuretics are substances that increase urine flow rate. Examples are caffeine and alcohol, which we said inhibit the release of ADH. Caffeine, as well as some other drugs, also inhibit sodium reabsorption, right? Remember the rule of the urinary system, water always follows the salt. Reasons why people take diuretics, it may be to help decrease elevated blood pressure. This is just an urban legend or myth about breaking the seal. Make sure you watch this video link below. Let's review urine formation and urine excretion. Blood enters the glomerulus and exits, but the glomerulus is leaky and this creates filtrate that enters into the glomerular capsule. These two structures make up the renal corpuscle. The filtrate then flows into the proximal convoluted tubule where there's reabsorption of essential nutrients and some secretion into the nephron loop, which just goes down and up. That's all descending ascending limb means. This is where water reabsorption occurs into the distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct. As we mentioned, these are typically impermeable to water unless acted upon by aldosterone or ADH. The urine, as it's now called, then flows into the minor calyx, major calyx, renal pelvis, entering the ureter to be transported to the urinary bladder for storage, and then elimination through the urethra. Look at the Greek and Latin word parts. Glomer, meaning little ball, such as a glomerulus. Nephro and reno, pertaining to the kidney. An example would be the term renal. Inflammation of the glomerulus of the nephron. This is a disease known as glomerular nephritis. This is typically due to after an individual had, say, like a strep throat, like streptococcus infection, where antibody-antigen complexes actually kind of block and irritate the glomerular capillary, and this causes them to become overly leaky and non-functional. This can lead to fatigue, also swelling. Pertaining to the kidneys, as we mentioned in the previous slide, be renal. Thank you for your time and attention. This completes our study of the urinary system.